Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Imperfect Show. I am Susanna, this is Jeremy, and this week we're going to be talking about something that we kind of all have been finding ourselves dealing with to some level or another here in the last few months. We've had to adjust kind of quite a bit in our lives, and everyone has, as far as maybe starting to work from home if you haven't already. But one of the things that we started to kind of notice towards middle of March, specifically, I mean, especially in our area, is the need to bring kids home to do their schooling. And just trying to figure that out in a different way. And for a lot of people that have never done that with your kids at home, or maybe just in a limited way, that was a very new thing. Yeah. And so I feel like a lot of parents have been dealing with this, educating their kids at home for the first time ever, or for the first time in a really long time. And so we just kind of wanted to talk about what our personal experience with that has been. We have done a variation of different types of homeschooling since our oldest was in kindergarten, and that's looked different kind of every year in different places that we've lived. There have been a few years where the kids have actually gone to school, Christian school, public charter school, just different things that we've done, but it always has included some combination of a type of homeschooling environment. And so we just kind of wanted to talk kind of a little bit through that and some things that we've learned, some things that we've experienced, and just kind of share that with you guys this week.
Yeah, this is a conversation that you and I have had really our entire married life, because we had our daughter very young. And so we've been talking about education and that, throughout their childhood. Our oldest is 20 and our youngest is 10. So we're still engaged in that. Your education, your degree is in education. You've taught in the classroom as well as teaching our kids, and in many other environments. You also helped a lot of folks kind of navigate this over the years, which has been pretty interesting. So this is a conversation that we have had a lot of and have a lot of experience trying to unpack and figure out and move forward. We've moved different locations, and so we've had to do different things in different places. But a lot of people have historically viewed the role of the government as the role of the educator. Now, we wouldn't say it that way necessarily, but everywhere you go, there is a public school. We have a vast public education system, and so many people have never really thought about this. And now, for the very first time, are thinking about it. And one of the difficulties with navigating this, particularly at this point in the year, we had all hoped that by this point in the year, we'd be looking at a fall that resembled last fall. Kids would be back in school. Maybe there will be some restrictions, but kids would be back in school. A lot of other things would be happening. But we're just not sure. My opinion is that in a lot of places, that's not going to be the case. And so parents now are asking the question, I need to work. I need my kids to be in school. I can't necessarily homeschool them. Or there are some public schools opening, but with the restrictions and the different kinds of things that are being imposed on them, I'm not sure that's where I want my kids. But because the question about education has not often been asked, there's not a good series of questions that parents can use to evaluate what their choices are, what the best way to go really is. And so that's what we wanted to talk about. Is we've looked at this, over the course of our lives, and we've had some good opportunities for our kids to go to different schools. And at one time, we put them in a school. It was a great opportunity, just didn't work for us. And we've tried, variations on just about everything. We've tried to use 3 questions to help us evaluate what's best for them. And so I want to talk to you about that. And this is more of me asking you questions because you're the expert.
Right.
It is my responsibility, and I believe this as a husband and as a father, to make sure that our kids have the best education. But clearly, you are the most educated in the education area. So I want to ask you about these things, and hopefully these will be a help to others. Again, 3 questions you can use to evaluate what you should do with your kids next year. This is a starting point, but it's a good starting point. And the first one is this: who is responsible for your children's education? Who is responsible for your children's education? So let's start there, because I think that's the fundamental question. That sets the tone and the stage for everything else. Who's responsible for your children's education?
It seems like that people are really confused by this because, like you said, for so long we have kind of maybe separated ourselves from the school system. Parents will put their kids in a school fully trusting that the teachers there have their kids' best interest in mind, that the system has their kids' best interest in mind, and almost I wouldn't say this is not a blanket statement. I just want to preface this by all this. It's not a blanket statement. This is not a talking bad about the public school system or anything like that. It's not about that at all. It's just we're trying to answer the question of who's responsible.
Yeah.
And I feel like for so long, parents have separated themselves from the school system and completely trusted that they will have their child's best interest in mind. And therefore, it can be a more hands-off. The teachers take care of that. I'm going to take care of, my work or whatever I need to do during the day. I'll pick my kid up at the end of the school. I'll help with homework. And that's about the level of engagement or involvement that parents have with their kids' education.
They feel like their responsibility is getting the kids to a place where they can be educated.
Yeah. I'm going to make sure that I put my kids in the best school there is, in the best possible environment I can, and then they will get what they need to from that place.
Right.
My issue with that, I guess, is that I believe that it is the parents' responsibility to educate their kids. And that can look like anything. It could look like I'm going to send my kids to the best school that I could possibly find with the best teachers, that has the best reputation, and I'm going to make sure that they can get the best education that I believe is possible for them. It could look like that. And then I'm going to be involved and make sure that they're actually learning the things that they need to be learning in that good environment that I have found for them to set them up for success in the future. And so it's that involvement of I'm going to make sure that they're learning what they need to. I'm going to ask the questions. I'm going to go to the parent-teacher meetings. I'm going to maybe be on the PTA. I'm going to volunteer in the classroom as much as I can. That kind of involvement is what is needed for your kids to be able to have a level of success in that kind of a situation. It could be that the way that you take your responsibility is by actually homeschooling your kids yourself and teaching them yourself. There's so many different ways that can look like, but the ultimate responsibility falls on the parents.
Yeah. Even from a biblical perspective, and I know some folks that watch this wouldn't necessarily believe the way that we do, and that's fine. But as Christians, as people who believe the Bible is God's word or wisdom to us, every time we see the education of children in Scripture, from Old Testament through the New Testament, the New Testament passages that talk about raising your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, Old Testament passages, all the way back to the law, the book of Deuteronomy that talks about teaching your kids all day, everywhere that you go. Passages that talk about training up our children in the way they should go. Wherever you find the education of children in Scripture, it's always from the parent to the child. And somewhere along the line, we've lost that, and we've given that responsibility to someone else. So when you're evaluating what you should do with your kids, not just this year, but every year, as it relates to their education, I think your decision process has to be built on a foundation of it is my responsibility as their parent to raise them to a point where they can go out and be a productive member of society and do the things they were created to do. Therefore, it's my responsibility to educate them. I don't have to be the teacher, but it is my responsibility to make sure they're getting the education that they really need to have. It's not someone else's responsibility.
I think what's really interesting too is that we as parents take very seriously our responsibility of teaching our kids, how to walk, how to get themselves dressed, how to feed themselves, how to take care of themselves, how to wash their hands correctly, how to ride a bike. Yeah. We take all those things so seriously. We want our kids to be able to have these skills, to be able to be independent and to be able to kind of do those things on their own. But then when they get to be school age, it's like, okay, well, now the education of them stops, and I get to now send them to a place where this other person is going to teach them, which is totally fine. But I feel like having that hands off where I'm not responsible anymore, that's where kind of I feel like we've gone wrong in our society, where parents completely have a hands-off approach to the actual education of knowledge of their kids. And this is why a lot of people are so confused now, because now all of a sudden we're having to ask ourselves questions that we've never asked before. Versus a parent that's really either obviously homeschooling their kids, but really involved in the classroom and engaged in what's going on at the school. You do not have to have a degree in education to be involved at the school and to be involved at the level where, okay, you understand what's happening. You kind of have a good grasp on kind of what's happening in our system, what direction we're kind of moving in. You just need to be an involved parent, and you need to be taking that personal responsibility that is yours for your kids' education.
Yeah, I've told this story many times, and I even told it on another podcast recently, but the story of Dr. Ben Carson's mom. Incredible story. Dr. Ben Carson, you're familiar with him, I'm sure, but one of the foremost minds in America today. He's currently the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, but an amazing man, a neurosurgeon with incredible accomplishments, an amazing human being. He talks about growing up in the inner city with his brother and his single mom, who was very young, and how he'd come home from school. His mom, after working several jobs, trying to keep things together, she was exhausted, but the first thing she would do is say, "Bring me your homework." And didn't matter what was going on, didn't matter what she was doing, "Bring me your homework." He describes this, how he and his brother would give their mom their homework papers. She'd look over it. She had a red pen. She'd mark it up. She'd give it back to him, tell him to do better, and continue to have, that back and forth. And the next day they do it all over again. And an amazing story. She's exhausted. She's a single mom. It's an inner city situation. She's trying to educate her kids. He then tells the part of the story that's incredible. He learned later on that his mom was illiterate. She did not know how to read. And so even with all of her limitations, she understood that it was her responsibility to make sure that her boys were being educated. And again, to the best of her ability and the best of her time and other resources, she did that. And taking the education of our children that seriously has got to be the foundation for which every other decision is made. That will impact things like working. Mm-hmm. It will impact things like how far away I work and what days I work and what kind of work I do. But it really has to begin with understanding that's my responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The second part of it is this. So that's the first question. Whose responsibility is it to educate your children? It's your responsibility given to you, I really believe, by God. The second question we have to ask then is this: where can my children receive an education that is in line with my worldview? We could spend a lot of time talking about worldview. We've talked about that a little bit in other discussions. But your worldview is how you view the world. It's right there. It's how you view the world. As believers, as Christians, we view the world through Scripture. We look at things and evaluate relationships and the things that we get involved in and the types of jobs that we do and the way that we live through Scripture. Everyone has a worldview. Everyone does. You have a worldview. It may be different than mine. Ours is very similar, of course, but in some areas it's a little bit different. We all have a worldview, right? How we look at the world. When educating your children, and why this is lost on so many people is crazy to me. When educating your children, you must ensure that the education they're getting is in line with your worldview. The way that you view the world should be reinforced through their education, not undermined through their education. There's a question in there, right? But there are a lot of things that could be said here. And I'll just say this, and then, Susanna, if you can give me your worldview on this worldview question. We have homeschooled most of our children's lives. We've done different things. Our kids went to a charter school when they were in high school, our two oldest kids. Our oldest is 20, and then we have a 19-year-old, and then we have a 12 and a 10-year-old. They've all been in charter schools, which at different times has meant they went to a classroom, and then we were involved with the other half of the education. Our older kids have gone to a private school. We've done different things over the course of time. We are not homeschoolers. We don't homeschool by conviction. Some people do. They would say the only way you should ever, because it's the parent's responsibility, the only way you should ever educate your children is by homeschooling them. And I'm not against that as a conviction. That's fine. That's just not where we fall. But through all of the things we've done, we've always come back to at least an integrated homeschooling approach, whether through a charter school or something else, because we wanted to control the worldview of the education that our children were getting. And this was the very best way for us to do that. This is not commentary on the public school system or our public education system or anything else. It is simply to say, if what is being taught in the schools and reinforced in the school is not what you would like to see taught and reinforced in your home, then something needs to change. Mm-hmm. And that's a worldview question.
Yeah. And it seems like that, and I feel so strongly about this, and we've had a lot of conversations about this just in the last couple of weeks. What we're seeing right now, the behavior of our society right now, in large, the people that are kind of I guess, uprising a little bit, to talk against some of the things that we're dealing with right now, politics and those kinds of things, are people in a specific age group. And
Right.
it's really interesting to me that the people in this age group that are kind of saying some of these things, pretty obvious that they don't really know maybe what they're fully talking about, what it has to do with these issues, have been educated in such a way that does maybe not reflect, maybe does reflect their parent, the worldview that was reflected in their home as well. But it doesn't really reflect that they have been educated in such a way that they understand history or that they understand the world in a bigger way. And so that's a problem.
Yeah.
If the majority of our kids are now coming out of high school
Right.
and they don't know who our first president was, and they don't know how our country was started, and they don't know these amazing things that have happened in history to bring us to where we are today, that's a problem.
Yeah.
Because then when political issues happen or life issues happen, they're going to respond in a way that reflects the worldview in which they have been educated. And that we're going to see, I believe that we're going to see that become more and more of a
Yeah.
problem
Yeah.
as we're seeing this next generation come up. And it goes back to number one, parents not taking the personal responsibility to educate their kids. But yes, then also that it maybe is not, parents are not making sure that the education their kids are receiving are reflecting the worldview that is maybe that they're trying to encourage their kids to do at home. And so one of the ways that what we have done is not to undermine what's being taught in the classroom, but maybe more support what's being taught in the classroom. So if your kids are at a school that maybe they're not teaching everything that you feel like your kids should learn, is supplementing with that at home, or having conversations about that, or having your kids read books about this, history thing, or this event that happened, or even, small things like spelling and grammar and some of that maybe that you feel like, well, that's not all happening at the school, but because I'm taking the responsibility for it, I'm going to make sure that my child is getting a full education so that it's going to reflect my convictions and the things that we want them to learn at home.
Yeah, it's interesting right now to see older Americans so confused by what's happening culturally, really. We could say politically and socially, but culturally. Why are these things happening? Why are these long-standing traditions and thoughts and ideas and philosophies and principles, why are they being pulled down, undermined, questioned? And, not all the questioning's bad, but why is all of this happening? Well, in large part, it's because parents have sent their kids to schools that didn't reinforce their own worldview. And so now the kids are acting on that. And that's the fault of parents. And then more individually, as our kids get older, they will start to ask questions. And if we don't help to establish a framework in their own hearts and minds to process the questions they have and process the things that they see in society, it's no wonder they're coming to conclusions that don't make us happy. I think even, in the Christian home, raising kids in a way that reinforces Christian values is what strengthens not only that child and the home, but the church. And in so many places across our country right now, we're seeing churches where the vast majority of people that attend the church aren't clear on exactly what it even means to be a Christian, what the Bible means, why it's important, whether or not it's all true. And in part, that's because parents will take their kids to church, but the rest of the week they'll send them to an institution of education where they're being taught things that do not reflect that home's or the parents' worldview. And this goes back to question number one: whose responsibility is it to educate your children? And it's not the responsibility of anyone other than you. And if it's your responsibility, then you are the one who must necessarily ensure that they're in a place that reinforces that worldview.
And sometimes that means asking uncomfortable questions. I mean, nobody likes confrontation. No one likes to be in that kind of a situation. But there's been more than one teacher meeting where I have embarrassed my kids because I will ask the questions and maybe it's probably because I'm very passionate about this particular topic and I do take it very seriously. But I've made my kids very uncomfortable a couple of times because of questions that I've asked or issues that I've pushed, or maybe asking, why are we doing this? Why is this important? Can we do it another way? Can we do something else to ensure that what we're doing is reflecting the worldview that we feel is important for our kids to take with them into the world? So it does sometimes require asking uncomfortable questions, maybe having a meeting with your kid's teacher that's not a organized parent-teacher meeting. Maybe it's setting aside a time where you can ask them these kinds of questions. Are you teaching this? Is this happening in the classroom? Asking the questions. And I think any parent that is even working a full-time job or part-time or whatever your situation looks like, you can do that. That's something you can do, is ask the questions. Figure out, okay, this is my worldview. These are the things that I feel like are important for my child to learn that reflect what we're teaching at home.
Right.
And then ask those questions of their teacher, ask the questions of the situation, or ask yourself the questions. If that's something that you've taken on for yourself and you are home educating your kids, ask yourself, am I teaching them all these things that are reflecting the rest of our life and are reflecting what I want for them when they get older, the types of things that I want them to be doing, involved in, thinking about, influencing the world with. And it's just asking the questions. And sometimes that can be uncomfortable, but that's what it takes sometimes.
And I think sometimes parents don't know what their own worldview is.
Yeah.
So it's easier just to kind of farm it out to someone else. But then the other thing is professional educators, people with degrees and stuff, they like to look at parents and say, you don't know what's important.
Right.
You don't know what you're talking about. Again, it's your responsibility to make sure that your kids are getting the education that they need to get, not that teacher or someone else. And there's some wonderful people that are teachers. We have wonderful friends that are teachers, and we love teachers. It's not that. It's just understanding that they can advise, they can help, they can kind of let you know what they believe the best way is, whatever. But at the end of the day, they're not responsible for where your kid ends up. It's you. And you take it seriously.
Who knows your child better than you, really? And who
Should
knows
be, yes.
what your child needs better than their parent? And so I think it's great to have great teachers. And like you said, we have friends that are great teachers. And I think great teachers are important. And I've had such good experiences with a lot of the teachers that we've come in contact with. But ultimately, they're not responsible. They're responsible for what they do in the classroom, teaching the kids with the facts that they need to know, but they are not responsible for your child in a parent kind of way. And only you know what is actually best for them.
Yeah.
And so that's not something that should be left up to them.
That's right.
That's not what they're responsible for.
That's great. So the first question is, who's responsible for raising my kids? Who's responsible for educating my children? The second question is the education they're receiving consistent with the worldview of our home? The third question, and this is the natural third question, because people will hear both of those questions and they'll say, I get it, I understand. However, because of my situation, whatever my situation is, I work full time, I'm a single parent, on and on and on and on we could go. Because of my situation, I only have one choice. I don't have other options. I don't have other choices. So the third question is this: what are my choices? I believe that in very, very few cases do you only have one choice. People will say that, and often that's kind of their cop-out, right? I don't have another choice. I don't have any other choices. Well, you typically have other choices. Now, sometimes they require more work, but you always, at least typically, have other choices. So when it comes to education, the education of my children, what are my choices? Not all of them.
There's a lot of choices.
What are some of them?
So I would
maybe
say
some basic ones.
I mean, there's a couple of obvious choices. Obviously, our country's full of public schools. I mean, that's a natural choice. You might have a school in your neighborhood. You might have, a school that's, in your district that you can go to. That's a really great school. And so I would say, obviously, that's the probably first natural choice for most people is let me find the school that's closest to me that I can go to because of my address or whatever. And I'm going to send my kid there. So that would be a natural choice. Another choice would be a Christian school. A lot of people that might have a Christian worldview would say, okay, well, if I send my child to a Christian school, that's going to reflect, they're going to teach the types of things that would be reflective of what we're teaching at home. So that would be a second kind of more natural choice. And then there would be the homeschooling. Okay, I'm just going to completely homeschool them at home. So I would say those are probably the three things that first come to mind for most people when they think about what are my choices for educating my kids. It would fall into one of those three. I think. And so most people, I feel like, kind of see that those are the only three kind of options. And Christian school is really expensive. So I think, and homeschooling takes a lot of time. So I feel like the natural choice for a lot of people is, I'm just going to send them to public school.
Yeah. So public and private, so non-Christian or non-religious, private school might be in one category. One costs money, one doesn't necessarily. And then the Christian school, I'm going to pay to go to the Christian school. Maybe it's a part of my church or something else. And then homeschooling. Talk about, say which one to start first. I'll say this first. On the public school part, depending on where you live in the country, your public school may be more or less conservative than others. And by conservative, I mean more or less in line with conservative values, depending on where you fall. You have to evaluate that. One thing for those that feel like sending their kids to a public school is the best thing for their kids is that it does not remove your responsibility to make sure they're getting an education consistent with your worldview. So if you come to the conclusion that a public school or even a private non-religious school is the best way for you, you have to do that by first answering the first two questions. Can I do this while maintaining control of my children's education and ensuring that their education is consistent with my worldview? I can give you an opinion on that, but I think if you use the first two questions, you can come to natural conclusions as it relates to those two options. I will say also as an aside, often because public schools are well-funded, private schools often are well-funded, there are so many extracurricular activities that parents will say, I'm sending my kids to that school because of a sports program or an AP program or some other educational opportunity. Again, that's the third question. What are my choices? The first two questions are who's responsible for their education, and is that education consistent with my worldview? If you can't do the third one while maintaining the first two, then you need to look at a different option. So the Christian school option, again, there are good Christian schools and not great Christian schools. Some are expensive and some not so expensive, definitely worth looking at. And I think that's, an investigation anyone can do on their own. Let's talk about homeschooling for a minute, because homeschooling sounds really big and ominous to a lot of people, but it can be as involved or as uninvolved as you want to. Can you talk about charter schools, the different choices with charter schools, and then, kind of work down to I'm sitting my kids in front of me and teaching them for 6 hours a day?
I think that depending on where you live in the country, this could look very different for you. Charter schools are not, I don't think they're like nationwide, like a lot.
They're in a lot of places.
A lot of charter schools everywhere. You might live in a place where the closest charter school to you is like 40 miles away or a couple of hours away. So they're kind of, in some parts of the country, I know it's not really very common to have charter schools. We happen to live in Southern California, and the charter school movement has really been picking up a lot of steam, I would say, in the last 10 years or so here. And so we find quite a few charter schools in our area. Our younger two kids that are 10 and 12 now, a couple of years ago, we did put them in a public charter school where they went to school 4 days a week and then they were home 1 day a week. And it was a nice school, a really small, good environment, and felt really comfortable having them there. But still really having to kind of maybe make up at home for some of the things that they were not teaching there. So just to give a personal example, one of the things that's really important to us as far as education, if you are not talking about maybe like a Christian type education, so remove maybe Bible knowledge. In addition to that, something that is really important to us is for our kids to have a well-rounded education where they're not just learning science and math, but also grammar, language, spelling, and history. And those are some things that are important because of speaking and because of writing.
Right.
And because even if you're sending a text or using the computer and you have Grammarly or whatever that is, you still need to be able to put like two sentences together that make sense. Yeah. If you're talking...
It's a liberal arts education.
Yes. And so to have a well-rounded education where all of the things are hit. And so one of the things I found at the public charter school that was not being done was a lot of the language arts types things and history. So there was a lacking in some of those areas. And so during that time, those are some things that we made up for at home in addition to some Bible learning. So that would be one maybe example of what you could do public charter school has that available, where it's a kind of more of a program where they go for a couple of days or a few days, and then they're home with you for a couple of days, and that's a really good opportunity to make up some of those things that you feel like would kind of round out their education.
Parents who are working full-time or working, most time, but they still want to be very involved in their children's education, that's a great way to go.
And really, I met a lot of parents who are work part-time, and they work from home, and so this was a really good kind of way for them to still be really involved, but also be able to work from home and have a couple of days where there's like no kids around. And this is a really great way for them to kind of have it kind of both ways. The other thing that a lot of charter schools provide is, for the high school, that was really great. And a lot of the high schools maybe not have a full-time program where it's like go to school a few days, are home for a few days. Really, we found for our high schoolers that was a great thing to teach them personal responsibility for their own work, to then prepare them for college. And so that was a really great way to kind of take our hands off of maybe being intimately involved with their everyday schoolwork, and still kind of knowing what they were learning, but setting them up a little bit more for college. Then there are some charter schools that provide resources to you, curriculums to you, for you to be able to educate your children completely at home. And I know quite a few families that do that, and it's really a great, I feel like, way to introduce yourself to homeschooling if you never have before. And there's quite a few moms that I've talked to who I have encouraged, just try it out. There's a lot of support there. Most programs like this in a charter school have maybe a resource center where you're able to go check out books, check out curriculums. You can look at different ones that you think might work for you. You'll be assigned to a teacher who's responsible for your family to kind of walk you through that whole process. Just so much support there that if you never have done it before, because it does seem very intimidating. And the other thing I like about that is that, a lot of parents say, I need another adult involved in my child education. I don't want to be the one that's also parent and also teacher.
Sure.
And it is very, very difficult, especially when your kids are younger. But I would say that if you have already educated your kids in some way, as far as teaching them things in the home, then that's not going to be that difficult of a transition. If you're already asking them to do certain things around the home, and that would be not a difficult transition then to make yourself also the teacher, because it's just one other thing you're asking of them. But having that teacher assigned to you at the school, if you're deciding to do the full-on homeschooling through a charter school, is a really great way to get another adult involved in your child's education that then your child is also responsible to. And so there's been a lot of success in that, and even families that I know that have never homeschooled before and have tried this out. And it's been a really great way to work with an educator, but then be able to have so much freedom at home to be able to kind of round out your child's education and kind of put together, it's kind of like a personalized program that's specifically designed for your child. And so they'll work with IEPs and a lot of kids that have special kind of learning needs to be able to structure an environment or a curriculum program for them to be able to kind of get the education that they need. Yep.
Told you she was the one. She knows all of these things.
No, I don't.
So that's charter schools. And then, there are numerous homeschooling programs. And I think parents think homeschooling and they think, I don't want to keep the grades. I don't want to set the schedules. I don't want to do the homework. I don't want to do the other thing. There are complete online programs administered by large private schools. There are public school programs that are completely online, again, managed by someone else. There are many curriculum options. It really is, once you start to look at it, and we're living in a good day for this. This has not always been the case, but once you really start to look into homeschooling options, so apart from charter schools, homeschooling options, you can find something that will fit your schedule and your children's schedule.
I think one of the negative things that often gets said about homeschooling, and we've heard kind of all of this in some way or another, is the socializing aspect of your kids. Like I want my kids to be social, and I hear that over and over and over again. And every time I talk to someone about homeschooling or someone asks me about it, like, how are your kids socialized? I don't know that is really hard or takes a really long time. I mean, your kids can now it's a little bit more difficult because of what we're dealing with right now as far as like the distancing and all of that. But in I guess in our normal kind of routine, you have your kids, most people have their kids involved in some kind of a sport league. Most people, parents have, if you're at church, you have them involved in the kids class at church, or the youth group at church, or they have some kind of socialization that's naturally built into their lives. You have family get-togethers. There's always, I feel like in life, there's always natural socialization that happens. And so I've not experienced that for myself, that our kids have not gotten enough social interaction with other kids. But if you kind of feel like that's you, there's all kinds of homeschool groups that you can get plugged into. And again, it's kind of like looking for a homeschooling type curriculum. You can search online for homeschool groups in my area and come up with so many groups of people that are meeting. They have, they go on field trips. They have classes maybe that one parent will teach a science, they'll do a science experiment together, or, the moms take turns teaching, or even dads sometimes will take turns, teaching the kids something or a skill. So there's so many options, and we are living in a really friendly world to this right now. And so I feel like over the last 10 years, our society's become a lot more friendly to kind of home educating our kids. And so there are so many groups now available to where if you feel like, I want a little more for my kids as far as socializing, that is available to them, because there's so many out there. Yeah.
And I think, the point of this number 3, what are my options? What are my choices? Is this. You have choices. Mm-hmm. Now, depending on where you live and, so many other factors, your choices may be more or less. I understand that. I think we both understand that. This is not to say that one of those choices is necessarily right for every person. But when you begin to filter the education of your children through who's responsible to educate them, and is the education they're receiving consistent with our worldview, then number 3 probably narrows down some of your choices at least. And, depending on your personal finances and your personal life situation, again, you may have greater or fewer. There may be folks who, for whatever reason, would say, this is not my number 1 choice for my kids, but this is what I have to do because of what's available to me. Again, the single parent situation, I realize there are a lot of things that can be very, very difficult, but it's understanding, again, fundamentally, I have to do whatever it is I need to do to raise my children in a way that prepares them to lead the life, really, that God put them on this earth to lead. And the burden that goes along with that on the other side, I think really becomes joy when you see, what it is your kids can learn and will learn, and what they end up doing with their lives. So we could talk about this all day, probably. This is a big discussion.
Yeah, it is.
And certainly this is not exhaustive. But as you consider these questions, and as you look at this for yourself and your family right now, and a lot of folks are looking at this right now, like in the next couple of weeks, we need to make a decision. How do I determine what's best? Well, ask yourself 3 questions. Who's responsible for their education? Is the education consistent with our worldview? And what are my choices? And once you start to break it down that way, again, you may not like the conclusion you come to because sometimes the best choice is not the easiest one.
Yeah.
But as you consider that, you'll come to the one that is best for you, for your child, for your family, and really, ultimately, for their future. So I hope that's a help to you. If you have questions, certainly you can drop that in the comments section. Or reach out to us. We'd love to connect with you. But thank you for watching again. If you know someone else who's dealing with this right now, send this out to them. If nothing else, maybe you can prime the pump, so to speak, and get them thinking the right direction. There's just so much to consider. And our goal here has been to just narrow that down and get you to look at just a couple of things. And if that happens, then we are happy. So
we're happy.
Thank you. Look forward to talking to you next time, and hope you have a great week.